Albert, the little boy within. Albert walked cautiously into my office, looking uncertain, as if he didn't quite know why he had come to see me. He gave me a quick, shy glance, then busied himself with a view of Ventura Boulevard outside the window. "I'm happy to meet you, Mr. O'Connor." I motioned him to an armchair, and hesitantly he lowered himself into it. I took the chair opposite Albert, and looked into the pale face of a neatly dressed, somewhat plump young man. Albert looked around the room and then commented, "I like your plants. Your office looks like a botanical garden." I've always favored the color green. On walls of forest green hang classic Italian prints of the high Renaissance era. Over the couch, there's a delicate, soft amber print of Da Vinci's Madonna and Child. There are lush green plants in Italian terracotta pots, which tower over the picture windows up to the ceiling. Two massive arched bookcases of dark walnut dominate opposite walls, heavily laden with books and cascading with potted ferns and ivy. I knew Albert would appreciate the ambience. He had told me on the phone that he worked in a nursery. His next words were, "This looks like my room at home, all this greenery." He managed a faint smile. "Wherever I am, I always try to surround myself with plants and flowers." Albert spoke in a slightly effeminate tone, with the wistful quality of a lost child. "An old lady came into the nursery today with a dying fern," he told me. "You're not giving it enough light," I said to her. "Ferns love lots of light, as long as it's in direct sunlight." She was so appreciative. I love to help people that way. A satisfied smile crossed his face. "I've often felt like that dying fern, not having been cared for properly." I sensed a fragility, almost a frailness, in Albert, who seemed to have been left far behind in the dreamy world of childhood. Albert still lived with his parents in the same rambling ranch house in Malibu that he had grown up in. His only sibling, an older half-brother, had long since moved away from home and married. During his first few sessions, Albert was quiet, sometimes staring at me with earnest brown eyes, as though he did not know what to say. It wasn't until weeks later that he finally felt comfortable enough to reveal his intense sexual feelings. Albert felt himself to be a little boy trapped in a man's body, torn apart by desires he didn't want to recognize. As he told me his story, the good little boy image broke down, and his words became more graphic. Then his voice would become shrill, almost hysterical. One rainy day, Albert started to talk about a common aspect of the homosexual experience, which I call alienation from the body. Most homosexuals describe a detached fascination with their bodies, rather than the comfortable familiarity more often seen in straight men. In fact, it is that natural comfort about their bodies that often makes straights appealing to gay men. Albert's own detachment from his body was extreme. He had been raised in a home where the masculine body was considered shameful and dirty. That day he sat down in his chair almost defiantly, reporting in his boyish voice, "It's been a bad week, and I've been having lots of weird feelings. I've hardly been able to deal with them." He added, a tone of guilt in his voice, "I've been feeling horny." "It's been a bad week because you've been feeling horny?" "Yes. I haven't been able to sleep. I've been feeling angry without knowing why." He went on, "I realize now that my reaction to any sexual feeling is always fear, then anger. Your anger is a defense against the fear. But fear of what? Why do sexual feelings frighten you?" "I don't know," he answered helplessly. Then, I've got a lot of conflict, shame, about anything physical about me. I nodded, listening. My mom always made a big deal about anything to do with the body. Really? Yeah, when I was little, she would have a heart attack every time I would lose control and wet my bed or something. If I got sick, she would call in all the aunts and uncles and just about have a nervous breakdown. And then she really went crazy one time when she caught me in some kind of sex play with my cousin. What happened? My cousin started it. All those years he did it to me. I never considered sex a molestation. I never realized he was using me. In fact, I thought he was my best friend. How old were you when you started? I asked. About 9, and my cousin was 15. He was very aggressive sexually. He always wanted to fool around. I was at that isolated stage where I wasn't connected to anyone, and, he admitted, I'll have to say, I was desperate for love. Now I have to forgive myself for accepting sex as love. I allowed my cousin to do things for me that I felt were wrong and I hated. I was crying inside, but I put on this act and allowed him to do whatever the hell he felt like. I asked, how often did this happen? Many times. Every time he came to the house over a period of years. What about your parents? Weren't they there? I don't know where they were. I have no idea. I just felt helpless the entire time. If I didn't go along with what my cousin wanted, I wouldn't have had him as a friend. He's a born manipulator. Ever since I was little, he manipulated me to get what he wanted. For a long time I went along with him externally, but inside I never really wanted it. Even while I thought I was getting love, what he did to me brought out my hatred. Albert continued. Finally, my cousin brushed me aside. Once or twice I got into the same kind of sexual stuff with another guy in high school, pleasing him so he'd be my friend. I don't know why I've let men manipulate me. I guess because they seemed adventurous and exciting, and we did fun things together afterwards. Albert was talking about that quality of masculine adventurousness and fun missing from the life of the good little boy. And what did your mother do when she caught you that time with your cousin? She punished me. Hit me with a belt and locked me up for a couple of hours in the bathroom. To this day, I think that's why I'm claustrophobic. She said God destroyed a whole city because of people who did things like I did. Albert continued. Like I said, I've only had sex a couple of times since those incidents with my cousin. Each time on the outside I went along with it, but on the inside I hated it. I'd think, I don't want it, it hurts. Then the next moment I'd think, come on, it doesn't hurt. It only hurt when you were molested as a kid. I still feel like a kid when it comes to sex. I explained to Albert the theory of reparative drive, that his sex play as a boy was an attempt to explore and secure his own maleness through contact with other males. Like most men who enter reparative therapy, Albert felt relief and reassurance in understanding that his homosexual behavior was an attempt to undo the alienation he felt from his own masculinity. Albert had described to me a very isolated childhood. He had experienced very little contact with other boys, and no affirmation of his maleness from either mother or father. Feeling inadequate as a male, he had attempted to find attention, affection, and approval, the 3 A's, as I explained, through homosexual contact. The shame that his mother conveyed to him only deepened his sense of alienation for maleness. You need to feel more relaxed and accepting toward your body, I told him. I know, Albert said. I feel like I'm behind the wheel of a big truck, but I don't have a driver's license. I feel like a little boy in a man's body. Then his boyish voice harshened and grew louder. It really is hard for me. Damn hard. I've always felt so goddamn guilty when I can't control myself. You felt your male body was never accepted by your parents. I always hated shaving, he said, and I hated being horny. In fact, I still do. As if being heard and understood for the first time in his life, Albert freely expressed his deep and long-buried frustrations. Any bodily function seemed like a problem. His words tumbled out in a brittle staccato. Every single time my body has to do its thing, gets horny, I feel very tense. I know I'm going to lose control and masturbate. Then I get scared someone will find out. I always try to force myself to have an orgasm before I go on a trip. I'm afraid if I stay at a friend's house or go camping with someone, I'm terrified that someone will see my bed is wet. I pray when I have to go to the men's room at the nursery that I'll be alone. Finally, I walk into a stall and try to pee. You're pee-shy, I said. What? He looked at me, surprised. It's called pee-shy, when a man has trouble urinating in a public restroom. It's an assertion issue that is related to being homosexual. He fell quiet, then said, I feel terrible that I'm a sexual human being who can feel horny and have an erection. Worse yet, that I think about having sex with men. Then he asked tremulously, Why do I deserve this humiliation, Dr. Nicolosi? What crime did I commit? Your crime, I said, was possessing a male body. I feel humiliated by my sexual feelings, he confessed. Then a wail. I am totally ashamed of them. Masturbation, he said, is my way of punishing my parents for not telling me about sex. It's my way of getting back at my mom, my dad, and my church for not letting me be sexual. It's a rebellion against being treated as a neutered being, I pointed out. Your masturbation is actually an assertion. Yeah, Albert said, pride in his voice. It's basically a fuck you attitude about one of the most painful things in my life. It's been 15 years that I've been in this battle. It's a way to say to my parents, you didn't really know or want the male me, so I had to find a way to let me out. We know that homosexual men tend to masturbate more often than heterosexual men, I told him. It's an attempt to make ritual contact with the penis, to connect with the lost maleness. Albert nodded, considering that. I have so much fear inside, he confessed. I'm scared to be masculine, scared to be a man. There's this thought that hounds me. Oh, you really can't do it. His shoulders heaved in a deep sigh of discouragement. What am I telling myself this stuff for? It's a script that you follow, I said. Why is sexuality fine for everybody else, but not okay for me? He demanded. Why can't I grow up like everyone else? He answered himself as accurately as I could have, saying, I still can't relate to my mom and my dad as an adult would. I still feel like a kid around them. I had heard these words often enough from my homosexual clients. I can be the good little boy with mom and dad, but I don't know how to be a man with them. As the months proceeded, Albert continued to progress in small but significant ways. He was taking steps in self-assertion, and was not torturing himself so much with guilt for his sexual feelings. The case of Albert is a dramatic example of a man who could not accept his natural masculine strivings. Yet many homosexuals describe a similar background of being treated like the pure, good little boy devoid of sexual feelings. Typically, this false identity is given to the boy by the mother. The father, who would be the only valid source of masculine identification, remains emotionally absent, failing to intervene or even notice his wife's excessive influence. It is quite common to find anxious mothers in the backgrounds of homosexual men. These intrusive, hovering mothers intend the best for their sons, but are unable to recognize and respond to their authentic needs. I remember my mother would say positive things to me, but I knew they weren't true. Once my feelings were hurt by some boys playing kickball. I must have been about 8, and I was kind of klutzy. I remember Mom saying, "Oh, you don't need those boys. You're too good for them anyway." He laughed ruefully. Her consolation felt good, but even then I suspected that she was lying. I went along with it because it made me feel good. And what was the lie? That I was somehow better than those other boys, that I didn't need to play with them. Although Albert's mother was anxious and over-involved, she was also, paradoxically, neglectful. Albert told me how, as a small child, he had had chronic ear infections. In her anxiety to do the right thing, his mother had over-medicated him with a continual supply of antibiotics. As a result, he developed a severe reaction to penicillin, which still, to this day, causes him problems. Albert reflected. I realize how very much my parents have taken away my dignity. He continued in a sad voice. Only with you do I feel free to let out that ugly side of me. He stopped, then added in a bewildered tone. It's weird. Recently I've begun to feel more and more distant from my parents. This distancing is very odd, because in spite of everything, I still do love them. No, it's not odd, I reassured him. You're facing important, long-buried issues. You're finally taking an honest look at your parents and how they affected you. You have to step back to do that. He sighed, sounding frustrated. I wish I could see you every day for a month, so I could get this struggle behind me. I'd like to take a whole month off from my job and get this crap over with. You can't hurry the process of self-acceptance, I told him. It's not easy to change the way we see ourselves. It takes work, based on a gradual process of small successes. Albert looked disappointed. Well, at least I've gained some control over my compulsive masturbation. It's not such a battle as it used to be. At one time, I actually went for over a year without masturbating. I prayed, I walked for miles, I did whatever I could to get my mind off the demands of my body. I felt the experience to be very humbling. But then I started to lose control again. I was constantly having homosexual fantasies. I was thinking about sex all the time. I sexualized every word that could be sexualized. Like each time I heard the word come, I'd think of an orgasm. I felt very scared, and that's when I came to you. I interrupted. Even though you white-knuckled it for 1 year, masturbation still controlled you. If you're going to gain control over this, you're going to have to relax and be more tolerant of yourself. He resumed his confession. When I got out of control, I used to talk dirty. I could write the filthiest porn stories you'd ever believe. He giggled. Total pornography. Then added, It was a hate response. A rage response. It wasn't me. I was always the pious St. Francis. He smiled cynically. Caretaker of the trees and flowers. Clearly, Albert suffered from an obsessive-compulsive tendency. Being permitted in therapy to express these anxious, dirty secrets, especially to another man, served to diffuse their intensity. He said, hysteria again taking over. How can I change the mixed-up state I'm in, when this feels like the way I'm supposed to be? The good boy is what my parents want, yet my body drives me in a different direction. This just seems like a built-in contradiction. You're certainly living that contradiction, I pointed out. You're trying to be both the good little boy and someone who masturbates compulsively. I added, and you're trying to cut yourself off from your own gender, as if you were schizophrenic. Albert said thoughtfully, I think a lot of my behavior is in response to all the abuse I got as a boy, just for being a boy. I remember thinking, Gosh, maybe if I were a girl, my parents would love me. Why would they have loved you more for being a girl? I asked. I don't know, puzzlement in his voice, but my mom certainly couldn't handle my being a boy. As for my father, he couldn't have cared less either way, really. He had very little to do with me. When he was involved, he was doing something with David, his kid from his first marriage. Albert fell silent, then brought up another barrier in his childhood. My mom ruled the house. She was on top of my father and me all the time, 24 hours a day. My dad, like me, was totally overridden by her domination. I doubt if anything he said could have had an effect on me. His voice rose once again to the hysterical level as he said, "Why don't I remember things my father and I did together? Why are these memories so buried, so distant?" He answered himself, "Because every memory of Dad is overshadowed by Mother. Everything was dominated by her, completely in her power." Then, almost a scream, "Why do you think I feel so powerless? I still am in her power. She stands over me this very day, in command of everything." "You're absolutely right," I said. He calmed down somewhat, then went on in a more normal voice. "It's not my life. It's her life I'm leading. No joke. Every single day something comes up where it's a mother thing I decide I have to do. As I stand in the kitchen and bite into a cracker, I know I'd better not let crumbs fall on the linoleum. Crumbs will attract ants, Albert. The hairs on the bathroom sink need to be wiped up with a tissue. Good boys leave the bathroom exactly as they find it, Albert. These mother things come down on me constantly." So this was why Albert identified with the plants he cared for. He was mothering his plants as he wished to be mothered, gently and kindly. "I realize I have a choice to make," Albert said. "I can choose to be very nice and shallow while I'm here with you, or I can be brutally honest and use this time for my recovery." "That's right," I told him. "The essence of therapy is to slowly recall the hurt, then to slowly reclaim the true self that the hurt has made you detached from." "Since coming here," Albert said almost angrily, "I've been feeling more like a little child, more uncontrolled and emotional. I've cried more in the last few weeks than in the last 5 years." I explained that therapy brings out buried feelings, and this is as it should be. "Lately I've been at the point where I let my emotions take over. Thanks to you," Albert said sharply. I wasn't sure whether I heard sarcasm, but decided not to question him. "How do you feel when you cry?" I asked him. "Ashamed, of course. When I was a small boy, I made a vow not to cry, and I'd always stuck to it." His voice sounded proud. "But this crying comes from really deep inside. It comes from a real hurt. A deep wound. Like I was torn away too early, separated from something for which I still feel a deep yearning." "You can still come back to that something for which you feel a deep yearning," I told him. "How will I do that?" "Through insight, then through new relationships." "New relationships?" "Yes, because intellectual understanding alone doesn't really change people." "What does?" Albert asked thoughtfully. "New experiences change people. You are not as yet experiencing non-sexual intimacy with a man. That's the next challenge for you to work on." Albert always appeared regularly for his hour. He was never even a second late, as though he considered each moment precious. One day he told me, in what was becoming a firmer, more assertive tone, "I've started making major breakthroughs here. Big bolts of lightning. Shocks of awareness. I can see that I've been making progress." One day he announced something he had not told me about. He said, "It was my mother who really encouraged me to seek therapy. She could see I was lonely and unhappy, so she thought it might help if I spoke to someone. I don't earn much at the nursery, So she and Dad are giving me money to come." I was surprised. She had not sounded like a woman who wished her son to learn more about his true self. Of course, she didn't know the real issues he was dealing with. "That was very understanding of both your parents," I said. "It's really my mom," he corrected. "Dad is just going along with her decision." Mindful that, as they say in Hollywood, there is no such thing as a free lunch, I asked, "Well, how do you feel about your parents paying for your therapy?" My concern was that Albert might feel compromised by their generosity. "Fine," he said emphatically. "They got me into this mess, so they can get me out of it." This made sense, given Albert's circumstances. Accepting his answer for the time being, I made a note to be on the lookout for any parental intrusions. "Recently, I've been finding myself looking more at men," Albert told me. "I do a lot of mental window shopping, which only makes me feel worse. I went to the mall last night, and I felt attracted to this guy I saw, about my age. But I had both this magnetic pull toward him and this need to push away from him." "I think the reason you find yourself looking at other men," I said, "is that you don't yet have a fitting male picture inside you, and so you keep searching for that image of maleness on the outside." Albert nodded. "So much of the attraction feels like curiosity, just wanting to know what guys are like." There was a sound of desperation in his voice. "But what part of you felt like pulling away?" "The part that feels a fear of men." I heard Albert's same-sex ambivalence, so characteristic of the homosexual condition. Even while eroticizing men, he felt uncomfortable around them. Then Albert seemed to feel the need to flee a confrontation with his painful ambivalence. He returned instead to a discussion of his blissful babyhood. I decided to go with it. "I wish I could forget all the conflicts of sex and adulthood," he was saying. "I wish I could return to the love I felt so freely when I was a baby, and happy just existing. Later, the realities of life turned everything into a bad dream." "Exactly what was it that turned such a happy existence so sour?" I asked. Following another short silence, Albert said, "I think when I lost that deep sense of bonding with my mother, the fear started. When I had outgrown mother, there was no adult identity that fit me. I had the sense that I was just suspended, abandoned." "In some ways you were. At a critical period in your development, the gender identity phase. You had to individuate yourself from your mother and develop a masculine identification through your father. It was your father who personified the demands of the outside world. As Freud said, the father personifies the reality principle. But you never received the necessary support from him, or any other masculine figure." Albert suddenly changed the subject, again retreating to the more pleasant subject of his dreamy childhood. "I used to draw a lot. I was a good artist. All the pictures were feminine things. Roses, colorful birds, ballerina dancers in tutus. Not soldiers or cars, but images of beauty. I never drew men. I didn't have a good picture in my mind of men. I really wasn't sure what a man should look like. If I tried to draw the Holy Family, the baby would look normal, sort of a generic baby face. But I'd spend the most time creating the Blessed Mother. The folds and creases of her veil, her hair, her nose, her lips. I'd try hard to create the ultimate, most beautiful Madonna. When it came to St. Joseph, I wouldn't have a clue. I simply couldn't draw his face. Then, when I was 11 or 12, I recall trying to draw pornographic pictures and feeling very unsatisfied because I couldn't capture the male. It disturbed me because I would draw men who looked feminine. I tried to draw a male pornographic picture, but it always ended up looking like the Madonna." Feigning a pious tone, I said, "Certainly the Madonna was more pleasing to God than pornography." "Probably," Albert laughed. But maybe this is why some gay men are into designing women's fashions. They still look on their mothers as the Madonna. He added, My mother always managed to mix me up in my perception of people. You might say she mixed me up in deciding where she ended and I started. Even now, when I'm talking with a woman customer at the nursery and I'm connecting with her, I feel her, the same as her. It feels like two women chatting, and I don't want that. It reminds me of when I was a teenager and I took a girlfriend to Dairy Queen. On the outside, it looked just like it was boyfriend-girlfriend, but on the inside, I felt we were the same. Ugh, I hate that. When I think back on it, it feels disgusting. I was happy to hear Albert describe his discomfort, knowing his individuation from the feminine was now well underway. Albert said, there are times you want to be by yourself, for your manhood. I've been trying to firm up my body, so I've put weights in my garage where I exercise. When I get sweaty, I strip down to my underwear. So then my mother walks into the room and says, Oh great, let's exercise together. I tell her, but I don't want us to exercise together. There I am, sweating and heaving weights in my jockey shorts, but none of that seems to faze her. Mom and I both belong to the same health club, and she wants me to go along with her. She grew up in a family that was always together, Albert said. That's her interpretation of the way things should be. Togetherness. Maybe you should explain yourself to her, I said. She was never a young man. She doesn't know how you feel. Albert's complaint about his parents was rather typical of male homosexuals. As a boy, he never got enough of the father, but he had too much of the mother. While he resented father's absence in his life, he resented mother's intrusiveness and interference. Father never empowered, and mother sapped what power he had. I urged him, explain to your mother what you're trying to accomplish for yourself. In a discouraged tone, Albert said, The trouble is, I don't know how to tell her. He sounded puzzled. I just don't think she hears me. We always end up arguing. It takes your energy away, I commented. That says it. Nobody can sap my energy like my mom. I repeated, Nobody can take your masculine energy away like your mom. Albert heaved a mighty sigh, sadness on his face as he allowed himself to delve into his hidden thoughts. I decided to try for an associated idea. And this is why you're fearful of getting close to women. Is it? The voice of a surprised child. Yes, because you don't trust women. You have platonic girlfriends, but when you start to feel closer to a woman, you fear you'll lose control to her. You fear she'll take away your personal power, like your mom. Then I asked, Can you talk to your mother and tell her how you feel when you're with her? She doesn't understand me, he said quietly but firmly. If I try to explain my need for independence, she'll feel rejected and insulted. Is there anything you feel ready to tell her? About some of the deficits, the needs? Fine, I agreed. That is the essence of the homosexual problem anyway. Speak to her in terms of wanting to develop a more solid sense of your masculinity. Albert talked on. For the past 2 weeks, I've been riding my bike with Jack, a guy I met at my bike club. We do 10 miles on the coast highway before I go to the nursery. Great. This is a guy you enjoy being with? Yeah. I get up in the morning, and it's not like this wimpy, drag-me-out-of-bed feeling. I like to get up early, just when it starts getting light, and the coast air is still cool. Jack and I get along really well, and the great part is that I don't worry what he thinks about me. But I'm always still a bit timid about bike riding. I worry someone else might be watching me and think, oh, that guy's just a faggot. I get kind of scared sometimes that I might hit a rock and fall on my ass. But as soon as I get warmed up, the thought vanishes. I tell myself, just get into what you're doing. And when I stop watching myself, and stop thinking about how I look, I get into that feeling of power. You're making fine progress. You have a fire going inside of you, and the challenge now is to keep it going. After you get a nice fire going, it starts to burn itself out if you don't put another log on it. The fire is your developmental momentum, and the logs are new challenges. One log will be the challenge of talking to your mother. Still another can be doing those long-distance bike rides. Yet another log will be maintaining those straight male friendships. These are the things that keep the fire going. A few months later, Albert entered my office and spoke excitedly. The last time I saw you, something happened that was absolutely incredible. His voice was much stronger now. Even in his excitement, it had lost that hysterical ring. He no longer avoided meeting my gaze, but addressed me directly. Last session, I felt weak and lonely. I guess I was feeling sorry for myself. But you gave me hell. You challenged me, and I gotta admit, it hurt. Then, 4 nights later, Steve from our group called me up, and he also gave me hell. Did he? I was pleasantly surprised that Steve could make such a decisive intervention. He lit into me, like he stabbed me again and again. He said, "You've got to really get out there and fight." He told me to stop bitching and grow up. I was insulted, and I said, "What do you mean? I can't believe you, Steve." But he just went on. "You're having the world's greatest pity party for Albert O'Connor. Don't you remember that book by Dr. Van den Aardweg? Stop taking yourself so fucking seriously. If you want to get out of that self-pity, first exaggerate it, then laugh at it." What Steve said hurt. He sighed. Then, sure enough, after I hung up, I really felt low. I felt betrayed. I'd gotten a double whammy. First you, then him. I thought, shit. Then I started thinking, Steve was right on the mark. Both of you are. You're both saying the same thing. And ever since then, when I feel the self-pity coming on, I purposely blow it out of proportion almost ridiculously, and then laugh my ass off. He continued, "I've told you I've had very little temptation recently to get into those compulsive masturbation marathons. I feel like I'm really starting to understand now what it's all about. Things are happening." I was pleased at his progress. "It's incredible. So freeing. I'm feeling alive for the first time in my life." Albert then went on to tell me about his bicycling club. He said, "I felt sort of wimpy at first next to those long-distance racers, but I just went with it. Last week I noticed this girl who came on one of the club rides. She's not a raving beauty by any means. She's got some pimples on her face, but there was something about her personality that turned me on. It wasn't sexual, but for the first time I didn't feel I was just one of the girls. I felt like myself, in my own way." Recalling his feelings about the girl led to associations about his body, and he went on. "Even right now, just sitting here, I feel no timidity about my body." "Why?" I asked. "This very moment I feel at ease doing anything with my hands." He waved his right hand in the air, then asked, "Is my hand motion a faggot motion? You know, effeminate? Either way, it doesn't bother me, whatever you might call it. It's just something moving. A hand," I said. Then added, "A lot of good stuff is happening to you." For the first time in the session, he looked worried. He said, "But of course, you've seen me up like this before, and then you've seen me crash." "Yes," I said. "So if you crash, so what? There may be a lot of downs, but that's not important. What is important is learning from your setbacks and reducing your recovery time." "What do you mean, recovery time?" I explained, "It's the time between the setback and your return to momentum. Refusing to wallow in self-defeat is essential. When I'm in that momentum, I feel like I've been set free." He looked happier. "Just being here, I feel like I'm the real me." "This is the real you," I said. "The you who is spontaneous, equal, talking frankly and directly and intimately with another man. The you who does not need to romanticize or envy other men." I thought, little by little, Albert is growing freer. At the following session, Albert brought up an important topic. Right after he sat down, he told me, "I remember that my mom was always really uptight, tense, nervous, anxious, especially about my health. She was really obsessed. Partly because when she was a child, her own health was pretty frail. My mother had headaches really bad when she was a kid. I think that the panic she felt from those headaches she conveyed to me. As a child, I had some very bad stomach aches. She panicked about them. It was like the end of the world when those stomach aches hit. She would always be pouring ginger ale down me, or tea, and she'd keep me home from school for a week. Any sniffle was exaggerated out of proportion into this big horror. My mother never saw illness or aches as natural. It was as if our family had committed some ghastly crime and was being punished for it by illness. I think this is why bike riding is so important to me. I want to push against this fragile body image. Whenever I experienced success, it was like walking on a tightrope. I knew I could fall at any minute, so I never enjoyed it. My mother always reminded me I might end up on my ass, so I never felt good or happy or excited. Albert's no-win predicament reminded me of the significance of Dr. Althea Horner's concept of intrinsic power, which she defines with the motto, "I am, I can, and I will." One's worthiness of this power is conveyed by the parents. The boy's sense of power is essentially linked to his maleness. It is through his masculinity that he discovers this intrinsic power. So if he does not feel fully masculine, he will always feel in some way unempowered. Albert said, "Not only have I been getting up early to bike ride, but today I had the desire to go out and play basketball. I never did this as a child. After all these years, I still wanted to get the feel of that ball in my hand and how it feels to sink it in a basket. I didn't care if I looked like an amateur." I pointed out, "We know that genuine transformation is happening when we discover many little manifestations of change. Together they all point to one thing, that something is truly changing. Something within you is really happening." "I hear people say that homosexuals shouldn't try to change," Albert said, irritation in his voice. "That a homosexual man has to follow his feelings, whether or not he likes them." His tone became adamant. "But who are they to say I shouldn't try to change? I never felt right living in the old way. Little by little, I'm becoming a different person. I'm finally becoming me." The day Albert left therapy was almost 3 years from the day he had first entered my office. His speech was far more assured. Gone was the occasional hysterical outburst. He smiled more often and talked of one day owning his own nursery. Some mothers, like Albert's, become too invested in their sons being available to them, at the cost of the boy's masculine individuation. They are so caught up in their own narcissistic needs that they never see their son's own needs. Robert Bly has said, "Women make boys, but only men can make men." There had been no man to make Albert, for his father had never been strong enough to disrupt the unhealthy mother-son closeness. Albert had had to survive emotionally with a father who did not know how to relate to him. To do so, he had developed a self-protective detachment from men. Originated by the British psychoanalyst John Bowlby, the term detached defensiveness was adapted to homosexuality by psychologist Elizabeth Moberly. It describes a child's infantile, self-protective maneuver against emotional hurt. Albert's hurtful relationship with his father resulted in just such a defensive detachment. Trauma, through neglect, abuse, or hostility, creates fear, which is the basis of alienation. When we are imprisoned by fear, we remain alienated from those who have caused it. Albert's defensive detachment was carried over to his relationship with other males. Emotionally distanced from males and maleness, he romanticized them. They represented the part of himself he had not claimed. Although he falls in love with other men and is intimate with them sexually, the homosexual never allows himself to identify with maleness. He admires it, he romanticizes it, and he may even wear the male role superficially. But there remains an inner resistance to claiming his full masculine identity. This resistance of defensive detachment emerges in male relationships in the form of criticalness, fault-finding, and promiscuity. The homosexual may love other men, but there is also hostility and fear of them. Thus his relationships with males are invariably ambivalent. Only in long-term male relationships that are intimate, accepting, honest, and non-sexual can the homosexual man begin to resolve the defensive detachment that causes this same-sex ambivalence. Albert had begun to resolve this detachment through relationships with many men, myself, men at work, and men in group. Every one of us, man and woman, is driven by the power of romantic love. It is one of nature's ways of making sure the human race endures. Infatuations gain their power from our unconscious drive to become a complete human being. In heterosexuals, this strong drive brings together the male and female through the longing for one another. But in homosexuals, the drive is an attempt to fulfill a deficit in wholeness of the original gender. Thus, two men can never take in each other in a full and open manner. There is not only a natural anatomical unsuitability, but an inherent psychological insufficiency. Both partners come to the relationship with the same deficit, as each symbolically seeks fulfillment of his original gender. About 1 year later, Albert telephoned me for a tune-up, as we called it. Since his termination, he had joined an ex-gay support group, which he told me had been very helpful. With this group, he had continued to explore his past relationship with his parents in order to understand their continuing impact on his life. Albert told me about a girlfriend, Helene, whom he had met at the nursery. She loves African violets, he told me enthusiastically. They had been dating steadily for 6 months. Before I could ask, Albert said, "Yeah, she knows all about everything." He described Helene as the best friend I've ever had in my life. I can tell her anything on my mind, and she's there supporting me. He said their relationship was physical, but not yet sexual. Albert's description of his feelings for Helene was not unusual for a man with a homosexual background. It is common for such men to proceed slowly towards sexual intimacy with a woman. Their relationships often develop in 3 phases: friendship, then affection, then expression of that affection through sexuality. This is in contrast to the heterosexual man, who is first sexually attracted to the woman, then gets to know her as a friend. Many men with a homosexual background expect to find themselves attracted to women in the manner of straight men. However, their approach to women may always be different. Ex-gay men need to be assured that because of their history, they may take a different path. Friendship first, sex second, to the same goal. About his homosexual attractions, Albert said, "It's very different from what it's been in the past. Now, because of Helene, I've made it my goal to fully claim the heterosexuality that I never developed. And I feel accountable in our relationship. It's not just me anymore. It's Helene and me. And so whenever those old attractions rise up, I say, what's going on here? then I can track those feelings for other men back to feelings about myself, such as, I'm afraid, I'm stressed, or whatever. Continuing, Albert told me, I understand these attractions as representing something that I did not receive as a kid, something I deserved, and I'm getting what I need more and more through my support group and opening up to other guys, which has been a wonderful thing for me. Then I asked, so does this mean that your attractions are not completely gone? In an unusually decisive tone, Albert answered, I believe they may always come back, now and then, just because of the depth of the deprivation. I see my growth as a continual process. Getting love and support from Helene and the guys in my support group makes all the difference. As he spoke on, Albert at last seemed to grasp the concept of the false self, the identity structure that lies behind the gay self label. I continued to understand my upbringing and its effects on me in the present. The messages I bought into as a little kid were, you're weak, you're not macho, you're this little nothing. In adolescence, that got translated into, you must be gay. Now I'm rejecting that false identity others tried to impose, an identity that others made me believe was me. No, I'm not gay. Now I'm determined to be the man I want to be, not to fall in love with him.